Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with www.learnvisualstudio.net. In this module, I'm going to try to sort out the difference between two different tools, the Azure SDK on the one hand, and then the Azure tools for Visual Studio. Now, admittedly, this is a little bit of a retread from topic matter that I wouldn't say that I covered it, but we definitely used it in the previous courses. I just didn't feel like I did a very good job explaining it. And so I inserted this module because I was getting confused about the different tools and which one you got when you installed the SDK versus the Visual Studio tools. What was the relationship between those two packages, I guess you could say. There's just so much terminology floating around with the word Azure in it that it's easy to get confused. And I thought if I'm getting confused, then there's a likelihood that somebody else is getting confused too. So I wanted to stop, take a moment, and get some clarity on exactly what is the Azure SDK and what is Azure tools for Microsoft Visual Studio. What do you get when you install them, how they're related to each other, and so on. So specifically, I'm going to be pretty much summarizing what you can see on screen right now. The first web page is the release notes for the current Azure SDK for .NET as I record this video, which is 2.5. And in addition to giving you a list of the new features and what you get in each of the tools, you also get known issues and breaking changes, but you get a lot of hyperlinks that will help you right-click, select Open a New Tab, and begin to just work your way through all of the jumping off points, all the hyperlinks on this page to better understand the SDK. The other web page that we'll use is specific to Azure tools for Microsoft Visual Studio. Again, plenty of good links here, a lot of sub-documents that would allow you to go off for further exploration, but that thoroughly explain what Azure tools for Microsoft Visual Studio is and why you need it. So let's go back to the PowerPoint and let's talk about what you get whenever you install the Azure SDK for .NET. Well, first of all, what is it? It basically overhauls Visual Studio and it makes Visual Studio an all-in-one Azure-focused development environment. So what does that really mean? How does that manifest itself in a practical manner? Well, you get a lot of neat things. You get project templates. You get command line tools, you get property dialogues and new windows in Visual Studio, and then client libraries that you can access from your own C# code for creating and managing the different types of Azure resources. So that will become obviously a big deal to us as we work our way through the various storage tools and how to create connections to them, how to do CRUD operations against those storage services, and so on. And we'll come back to that in just a moment here. But let's point out a couple of the specific tools that I think are the most important for our purposes in this course. The first tool that I think you'll find very helpful is the storage emulator. So we'll be looking at Azure Storage Services, and this emulator will mimic or emulate the services offline on our own local computer, so we don't have to go out and create our own Azure account if we don't want to, or we don't have to set up the services online and risk forgetting to turn them off when we're done with development each night or over the weekend. So that will be a useful tool. The next useful tool are a series of quick start examples. So if you pop open Visual Studio after installing the Azure SDK, you will, as you go to File, New Project, and let me give a word of warning here, especially if you're a little bit new to Visual Studio. This new project dialog changes more than probably any other window or dialog in Visual Studio because the project templates keep changing. And so it's highly likely after you watch this video months from now, after I record it, that what I see on my screen is not what you see on your screen. But so you might have to hunt around for these quick starts, and I suppose there's a possibility that they may even remove the quick starts at some point. But if you go to Install Templates, Visual C# Cloud, you should see a subfolder called Quick Starts, and this will give you a series of project templates that are essentially just console window applications that exercise a given API for, in this case, blob storage, cache, document DB, media services, queues, table storage. It even gives you deployment scripts for virtual machines and how to manage websites, I guess with PowerShell. I haven't really tried it myself. But for example, if I wanted to learn a little bit about table storage, I could just select this quick start and then click OK. It'll create a new project with the name that I give it. And then if I open up the program.cs file in the main area, you'll see that there is a bunch of code that's highly documented with comments, giving you some information on what this code example does, gives you documentation references, more jumping off points to learn more about, in this case, table storage, instructions about how to get this up and running on your own local computer. And then finally, you'll see that after you create a connection or create a table and a connection, then you can perform basic table operations, advanced table operations, you can delete tables and so on. So it calls out to these helper methods to do things like create a table for the demonstration, create a new entity, update that entity, delete the entity, and so on. Query for the entity. So that's a very helpful tool. And as I said in the previous module, I created some of my own code examples, and whenever I feel like they add clarity to whatever you'll find in these quick starts, I'll dust them off and show them to you. Otherwise, I'll usually point you to these quick starts or the quick starts on Azure's own developer pages. Okay, moving on. Whenever you install the Azure SDK for .NET, you also get the Azure Storage Client Library. And actually, whenever you install the Azure SDK for .NET, you get several different libraries. But I wanted to highlight the Storage Client Library because we're going to be talking about storage services here in just a little bit. And it'll be crucial as we go throughout this lesson. Basically, the Storage Client Library contains the .NET specific classes that are wrappers around calls out to the HTTP-based RESTful Azure Management API that you'll recall we talked about in the very first course. And so it'll do things like allow us to establish a connection with the given service. It'll allow us to perform CRUD operations against blobs and tables. It'll allow us to queue and enqueue messages on Azure storage queues and so on. And while you do get this client library installed on your local computer from the Azure SDK, probably what you'll want to do is utilize NuGet instead of relying on this local version, because NuGet will always install the absolute latest version, and it'll help you keep all of the dependencies. So in other words, the storage client library depends on a bunch of other client libraries for various purposes, and it'll keep all of them updated as well as you continue to develop. And so how do you get the SDK? Well, the documentation says that you can go to File, New Project, C# Cloud, and then from here there should be an option to get Microsoft Azure SDK for .NET. As you can see, that option isn't shown here. For me, they may have updated the new project dialog since they updated the documentation, or I already have the client library, the Azure SDK installed, so maybe just remove that entry. I'm not sure. But honestly, the easiest way to go about this is just search online and find it and install it. You'll also probably get a notification that that there's a new version of the Azure SDK for .NET available. Do you want to install it? All right. But moving on, what you also get in the Azure SDK for .NET is the Azure tools for Visual Studio, and this is something that we're going to cover in a little bit more depth in a couple of modules here. And so to talk about that more specifically, it contains tools for creating, managing, and publishing cloud services, and we're not really discussing cloud services in this course. Web roles have really been replaced for the most part by Azure websites, as we talked about in the previous course. Worker roles have to some extent been replaced by web jobs. They're still supported, but there are newer technologies that are a little lighter weight and easier to work with than these older Azure tools, web and worker roles. However, you still get tools to manage and publish cloud services. You get tools for managing storage services. So, and we've seen this in the previous course when we were working with web jobs, and I showed you queues, and I showed how we were able to, and I think we worked with blobs too in that. You can use the Server Explorer and find your queue, find messages, how many messages are currently on the queue, find how many blobs, and even drill down and see the blobs represented in blob storage. So we'll become more familiar with this. We're going to devote a module to this soon for using tools for managing storage services. Also inside the Server Explorer, there are tools for managing virtual machines and also tools that allow you to remote desktop into Azure Cloud Services, again, web and worker roles, or into virtual machines, all from the Server Explorer. And then finally, you also get a number of new windows for diagnostics and performance. Now, again, a lot of these apply mostly to cloud services, but they also apply to virtual machines. So things like monitoring Windows event logs and performance counters and profiling, profiling CPU, profiling instrumentation, profiling memory allocation, profiling concurrency, and also application logging. So we saw some application logging when we watched the live logs from Azure websites in the previous training course in this series, but there are other application logs that are available for like web roles, and you can monitor them from the tools that are installed whenever you install Azure Tools for Visual Studio. Okay, so our focus is in the next two modules will be to kind of hone in on two of these tools, specifically the storage emulator. Here, let's get to the next slide here. The storage emulator, and then also the Server Explorer management of storage resources. So before we get to that, I'm actually going to talk about what Azure Storage Services are in the very next module, and then we're going to look at these two tools in the following modules because they'll help us as we move forward in this course to develop applications against the storage emulator, for example, and then also to manage the resources that we like, the CRUD operations, to see was our update successful from the code that we wrote by using Server Explorer to kind of pop in and see the data in more of a tabular format right inside of Visual Studio. All right, so that's it for this lesson. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you.